You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Narratively, Exodus 5 functions like that moment in a movie when the heroes think they're going to win, but then things get way worse. Moses went in expecting immediate results, and instead, everything falls apart in this chapter. This story sets up the real struggle in Exodus. Israel's freedom won't come easily, and even their own people won't be on Moses' side all the time. This chapter is a clash of the gods and their representatives, a fight over jurisdiction and identity, and it's about to get a lot worse before it gets any better. This chapter shows that having God in your life isn't the answer church promises you it will be. The presence of the divine is not some genie in a lamp that is automatically going to grant you a wish. Rather, God is the great disruptor, and not just in the lives of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but also for Moses, Israel, and ultimately for all of us. Nothing gets an episode off to a rip-roaring start like a bit of poorly pronounced German. So I'm sorry that this is how we're starting off here today, but I think this is going to set the tone for the first verses if I give you this little bit of a really nerdy deep dive for just a minute here up front. So please stick with me. I realize this is getting way into the weeds like immediately here. I usually at least read a few verses before I get that far out into left field. But I came across this quote by Gary Rendsburg, a rather renowned biblical scholar. And I think he brings out an element of this story that is, well, I never learned it until I read this from him, so I'm guessing I'm probably not the only one who wasn't familiar with this. Rendsburg begins, a well-known genre in Egyptian literature, and this is where you learn that I don't speak German. The word is Koningsnovelle, and any of you who do actually speak German, I'm so sorry, you're going to have to hear me say that a few times here. But he goes on to say, this is a well-known genre in Egyptian literature. Yes, I realize I just gave a German word for an ancient Egyptian form of literature. It's because there were a lot of German scholars a couple hundred years ago that were researching all of this, and they tended to give very clunky German names to all of these scholarly things. So, Koningsnovelle, the basic elements of which are as follows. The pattern became a stereotyped one. First, the motivation is given for some royal activity, often of a ritual or military nature, and is frequently received through the medium of a dream. Next, the king's plans are outlined to a gathering of courtiers and officials who are usually skeptical and hesitant. And finally, the exploit is successfully accomplished. Siegfried Ehrman sought to observe the Koningsnovelle in biblical material that relates to the history of David and Solomon. But Rendsburg notes that many biblical scholars have not been convinced by this. So he goes on to say, as far as I'm able to determine, no one has suggested yet the story of Moses as an example of Koningsnovelle. But if any segment of biblical literature is to be seen as related to this Egyptian literary genre, it would certainly be this Moses narrative viewed as a whole. Moses has a task to undertake, namely the freeing of the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. There are major obstacles in his path, and most noteworthy is the fact that the situation gets worse before it gets better. I refer to the setback caused by Moses' first appearance before Pharaoh in this chapter here. An audience that resulted in the king's command that the Israelites produce the same daily quota of bricks, but without the Egyptians supplying them with the straw necessary for the manufacturing process. This leads to the people, or at least the Israelite foreman, vilifying Moses and Aaron for making matters worse. Only after this initial setback does the situation improve, a la the pattern of the Koningsnovelle, eventuating in the achievement of the goal, the liberation of the Israelites from slavery. End quote. Like I said, I know that's a really, really nerdy way to start out the episode, but it's kind of helpful to have that in the back of your mind as we're reading through this chapter, that it appears the story was structured to match a particular genre of ancient Near Eastern storytelling, yet again showing that the Bible was not written in a vacuum. It is often drawing from and riffing off of and even responding to the culture of its day. Okay, let's go ahead and read the first 9 verses of the chapter. And afterward, and I know I just said I was going to read the first 9 verses, but let me pause and just remind you that whenever you're reading the Bible and you come across some word that is signifying previous interactions, a previous story, previous dialogue, whatever it may be, that is a reminder to you that there is a greater story at play. It's really easy with the way our modern English Bibles are set up in chapter and verse divisions to imagine each verse as its own individual thing, or each chapter as its own individual thing. But the very fact that this chapter begins with "and afterward" begs the question, well, after what? And that's the reminder to make sure you are caught up on the previous chapters. So if you haven't listened to the previous episodes in this series, I definitely recommend you go back and do that before carrying on here. All right, now let's continue. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, "Thus says Yahweh God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who's Yahweh, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh, neither will I let Israel go." And they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us go, we pray you, 3 days' journey into the desert, and sacrifice to Yahweh our God, or else he's going to fall on us with pestilence or with the sword." And the king of Egypt said unto them, "What are you doing, Moses and Aaron? Letting the people from their work? Get back to your burdens." And Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are many. You're making them rest from their burdens." And Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, "You shall no more give the people straw to make brick, as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. And the number of the bricks which they made before, lay on them. You're not going to diminish any of it, for they are idle. That's why they cry, saying, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Let there be more work laid on the men, that they may labor therein. Let them not regard these vain words." Whew, that escalated quickly, right? Well, this is the first time that Moses has appeared in the Egyptian court again in over 40 years. I mean, imagine living in the town you were born in for 40 years, or at least near there. I realize Moses was moved into the palace. So living in the general area that you were born in for 40 years, then having to leave overnight as a fugitive for murder, and then returning back 40 years later to tell the city officials that you need to lead a large portion of their workforce out of the town for a good while. None of this trip could have been easy on Moses. That's something I've been really trying to draw attention to throughout this series, is to humanize Moses. It's really easy for preachers to look at the number of failures throughout Exodus to Deuteronomy, and honestly the entirety of the Bible, and say, oh, how did these people not have faith, and just to start railing on them of like, oh, Moses is really not trusting God here. Okay, would you do any better? If you had to go back to the exact place where you were wanted for murder and say, I am going to take a large portion of your country away from you, and yeah, we're just gonna go, like, what would you expect? What would you be feeling in that moment? I know some people would probably say, oh, well, he had God with him. He should have been more courageous. Okay, well, do you believe that God is with you as well? Are you ever still fearful? Absolutely. It doesn't change just because this was a couple thousand years ago. So let's remember, these are very human characters, and their fears and frustrations in the story are probably more valid than we have presented them in the past. It's also really easy to overlook Aaron in this story. We tend to focus on Moses because, well, he's kind of the main character through a lot of Exodus and a good bit of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as well. But Aaron's presence is a lot more important than we often consider. If he is going to be the representative of a new priesthood, his demonstrations in front of the magicians of Egypt would be quite significant in establishing his new authority. I mean, this is somebody who's, like, this is his first day on the job, and he's going toe-to-toe with people who have been doing his job for a long time, but for Egypt instead. Now, if you've been following along with our series here in Exodus so far, you may have realized something is missing in this chapter. It's okay if you didn't. I've kind of hinted at it a little bit in the past couple weeks of the series. And that's, if you go back into the previous chapters when God was speaking to Moses on Sinai, he told him to take the elders of Israel with him. But in these 9 verses that I read, the elders of Israel are nowhere to be seen. Now, they are in the previous chapter when Moses and Aaron go to them and try to convince them that Yahweh spoke to them in Sinai, but they're not here. God had told Moses to bring the elders with him and Aaron when they went before Pharaoh, but the elders are not anywhere in this part of the chapter. It doesn't seem as if they went before Pharaoh with Moses and Aaron. Interestingly enough, there's also no mention yet of the staff that Moses was specifically told to take with him. And to make matters worse, Moses here references a feast when he's speaking to Pharaoh, a celebration of some sort that God did not specifically mention in the message he said to relay to Pharaoh. So this brings up a rather convoluted question of, is Moses changing the message, or is the text leaving out details? Because in all fairness, it is possible that the elders were there with Moses and Aaron, and for whatever reason, the author just didn't mention them. It is possible that Moses had his staff with him at this point, and the author just didn't mention it. It's possible that back on Sinai, God told Moses something about a feast that just wasn't recorded, and that's why Moses mentioned it here. The biblical authors are not interested in providing us a comprehensive account of everything that ever happened in the lives of these characters. That would be an unfathomably large volume of work. Like, you automatically have to leave out some details when you're telling a story. If I told you the story of how I met Jana, my wife, there would definitely be some details that ended up getting left out because this has been a story over several years of our relationship together, and I can't take several years to tell you that story. So it is possible that the biblical authors were just leaving out certain details that they didn't see as applicable at that point. That being said, though, the biblical authors were very skilled and crafty writers who were very, very particular about what they put into the text. They were very intentional about what they put in. Hopefully, you've seen that as we've done these studies and pointed out certain details and patterns that really bring out the beauty and literary artistry of the text. They are also very intentional about what they leave out sometimes. So I can't help but think that these omissions, plus the addition of the feast, are very intentional on the parts of the biblical authors to say, Moses might not be exactly following God's command here. And perhaps that is why Pharaoh responds so poorly. Again, this is a little bit of speculation because you're playing the what if game. We only know what happened, we don't know what could have happened. And God did say on Sinai that Pharaoh would not initially concede and let the Israelites go. But I do think the authors are inviting us to consider maybe things could have gone a little bit differently. Maybe Pharaoh would have responded a little bit differently, at very least maybe not have increased the workload had Moses more closely followed God's instruction. We can't know for sure, it's a guessing game, but I do think we should lean on the side of the omissions being intentional to get us to think about how closely Moses is following God's instructions here. I will also point out this is the first occurrence of the phrase, "Thus says Yahweh," that will show up several other times in Scripture. So it's interesting to see that now we have somebody speaking on behalf of God right after, just a chapter or two back, God told Moses he was going to be to Aaron and to the Israelites and to Pharaoh in the place of God. I realize it was God himself who said that to Moses, but we must acknowledge the inherent danger of having people speak for God. This goes for prophets, this goes for pastors, this goes for when somebody in church tells you, I think I have a word from God for you that he wants you to do this. We need to be very, very careful when claiming to speak for God. There is so much subjectivity that gets into it that even if the very message itself truly is from God in its purest form, as soon as it comes through us as flawed human instruments, we risk getting it wrong, misinterpreting it, misrepresenting it. So we should be very, very cautious when seeing language like this of a human saying, "Thus says God." It is really easy to misrepresent what God actually has said. Several times in this series already, I have referenced the renowned biblical scholar Robert Alter. I want to bring out a quote from him again here. I like his insights. He says things that I don't find in many other commentaries. So he points out here that the abruptness of Moses and Aaron's address to the king of Egypt is noteworthy. They use none of the deferential forms of speech, none of the third person bowing and scraping, which are conventional in biblical Hebrew for addressing a monarch. Instead, they immediately announce, "Thus says the Lord," and proceed to the text of the message, which begins with an imperative verb without the polite particle of entreaty. William Propp observed that in doing this, Moses is not following God's orders. He was to have spoken together with the elders, who appear to be absent. He was to have performed his two portents. He was to have threatened Pharaoh's firstborn in God's name. As to the absence of the elders, Rashi, following the Midrash, suggests that they slipped away in fear one by one as Moses and Aaron approached the palace. End quote. I love that little addition there. Remember again, as they mention that they're going into the wilderness, that wilderness in the Bible is not wilderness in the sense of the jungle. It's not even necessarily a desert. It's just an uninhabited, uncultivated land. So it has less to do with terrain or climate, more to do with the absence of civilization. Open land where nobody is. In verse 2, when Pharaoh asks, "Who's Yahweh that I should obey his voice to let Israel go?" This is not his proudly proclaiming not to be a Christian, okay? This is the kind of verse that would have gone pulled out in the churches I grew up in and used to mock people who weren't Christians and say, oh, there are people out there who will just say, who is the Lord? I don't know this God. I don't know your God. I don't follow your God. I have that. Okay, that's not what Pharaoh is saying. Pharaoh is not here claiming to be an atheist. This is where our modern Western sensibilities get in the way. Because in the modern West, we don't tend to think of any gods other than maybe the Christian God, or perhaps a Muslim representation of God. But we don't really tend to see a bunch of idols around, or we don't consider other supernatural beings to be gods. That is very different from the ancient Near Eastern culture that the Bible was written in. The people in that time and place believed in the reality of multiple gods, including Israel. There's a pretty common misconception that the Israelites were monotheists, that they only believed in one God. That was not the case for any people back then. That has not been the case for most people throughout human history. Israel was monolatrous. The difference between monotheism and monolatry is that monotheism says there is only one God. Monolatry is we worship only one God. The Israelites were not monotheists. They believed in the existence of other gods. That's why sometimes they went after Baal or Ashtaroth or Dagon or any of these other gods that are listed throughout the Hebrew Bible. There are quite a few supernatural entities listed as other gods because the Israelites knew these gods exist. They are the patron gods of these other cultures around us. But we only worship one. That is Yahweh. So it's not that they denied the existence of these other gods. It's that they denied the authority of those gods over their land. They worshipped Yahweh alone. So when Pharaoh says, who's this Yahweh that I should obey him? I don't know Yahweh. He's not claiming to be an atheist. He's not mockingly saying, oh, I'm not a Christian, or, any of that stereotype. No, what he's saying is, I'm Egyptian. I'm possibly, depending on the dynasty, either considered a god or at very least a son of a god, and I am not familiar with this Yahweh. I mean, take this very literally. He was saying, Yahweh? Who's Yahweh? I know dozens of gods, probably hundreds of gods. I haven't heard of this Yahweh. What are you talking about? See, this is part of my problem with so many English versions translating the name Yahweh as capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Lord. I understand a lot of it is rooted in deference, trying not to misspeak the name of God, and that's rooted in a very Jewish understanding, which I respect. There are some people who choose not to say the name Yahweh out of respect. I've laid out previously on the podcast why I don't think it is unbiblical to use Yahweh instead of Lord. In fact, I think it helps to elucidate certain biblical texts that just sound very Christian when you refer to the Lord. It's a very generic term, but when you realize that the name Yahweh is behind it rather than the title Lord, it shows that there's actually an identity claim at work here. This is a fight of the gods. Are the gods of Egypt in control? And we're certainly going to see that as the plagues come about. Or is Yahweh in control? I believe we lose a lot of the initial push of the story when we take the name Yahweh and replace it with the generic title Lord. So remember, this is a battle of the gods that's going on here. And Pharaoh is saying, if your God was worth knowing, I would have already known about him. He has no authority over this domain. And remember, this is the low point of the story. This is where things get a lot worse before they get any better. And so we're going to eventually see that Yahweh does, in fact, have dominion over the realm of Egypt. But Pharaoh doesn't believe that yet. So Moses responds by now saying, well, the God of the Hebrews met with us. Now, this isn't just like his restating Yahweh met with us, the God of the Hebrews met with us. It seems like this is his way of trying to salvage the situation. Like, oh, you don't recognize the name Yahweh? Oh, okay, well, you know we're all Hebrews, so this is the God of our ancestors. He's trying to put it in terms that Pharaoh would understand, which honestly kind of sounds like talking down to him a little bit, and it's rather amusing to me. So if the designation God of Israel in verse 1 didn't work, perhaps now God of the Hebrews in verse 3 would work. But why would he think that would be more significant? Isn't it basically the same thing? Well, the Tanakh doesn't refer to the Jews as Hebrews very often. That term Hebrew has become more common in parlance today, but it's used surprisingly little in Scripture. The Jews were usually either just called Jews or Israelites. They weren't often called Hebrews. However, in Genesis 39 to 41, Joseph is called a Hebrew 4 times. So I can't help but think that maybe Moses was hoping the Pharaoh might have heard something about Joseph the Hebrew from several hundred years earlier and would respond better to that than he did to the representation of being the God of Israel, which, remember, Israel isn't a nation yet, so when they say Israel, they're actually referring back to the ancestor Jacob. Okay, you don't recognize our patriarch Jacob. Would you recognize our patriarch Joseph? Does that name mean anything to you? And of course, we find out in the next verse, no, it did not. Following that thread of thought just a little bit further out, in the Tanakh, God identifies himself as the God of the Hebrews only 3 times. Once in chapter 7 and twice in chapter 9. So in the entirety of the Old Testament, God refers to himself as the God of the Hebrews only 3 times, all here in Exodus. And it's in chapter 7 and 9. Now, there's a few other times when other people identify him with the Hebrews, and they're all in between this and Exodus 10:3. So this designation, God of the Hebrews, only shows up within 5 chapters of the Bible, and it's these contiguous 5 right here. The way that King James put this verse, when Moses and Aaron say, "We pray you, let us go 3 days' journey into the desert," I don't know about you, but when I read that, it sounds like it's softening the tone. Like saying, "Oh, can we go out, we pray you," just a little bit. Like he's trying to soften the blow of what he's saying. However, that phrase that is translated into English as "we pray you" serves a dual purpose in Hebrew. It can mean something along the lines of "we beg you, we implore you, we beseech you, we ask you, we pray you," but it can also add emphasis, like "surely" or "now." So, given the boldness with which Moses is speaking to Pharaoh, or possibly Aaron is actually speaking to Pharaoh since he would be the mouthpiece here, it could be more accurate to translate the phrase as "the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us go now, 3 days' journey into the desert," or "let us go surely into the desert." Any of those options are legitimate, but I would lean a little bit more toward the forceful reading because they do seem to be coming out of the gate swinging here, even though Pharaoh does as well and knocks them back pretty quickly. The word used for sacrifice here, when they say that we need to go and sacrifice to Yahweh our God, is actually a very violent word. It's not just the generic word for sacrifice. This implies a slaughtering and perhaps even a burnt sacrifice later. Surprisingly, it's actually only used twice before this in the Bible. So, in the entirety of Genesis up through Exodus 5, that word is only used 2 other times. And both of them are in reference to offerings that Jacob made after leaving Laban's house. I don't know that there's any massive connection there, but given that we did see distinct hyperlinks between Moses' story and Jacob's story, particularly when he was leaving Laban's, this was back in the last chapter or two, I can't help but think that maybe that connection is there purposefully. Granted, shared vocabulary is not automatically a hyperlink, but it does seem a tad coincidental for me. Again, with this verse, we have to ask, is Moses adding to what God said? Because, and I keep saying Moses here, I realize Aaron is the spokesperson, so I'm kind of using them interchangeably. Is he adding to what God said when he put in this part about God will bring pestilence or sword? He will fall upon us with this. We saw in the previous chapter that God gave a message to Moses threatening Pharaoh's firstborn, but Moses is saying this as if he himself, the Israelites, are at risk as well. God did not say before this that he would punish Israel if Israel couldn't go worship him outside Egypt. So again, let's be really careful when we claim to speak for God, it is really easy to misrepresent what he said, and then that can just make things way worse, as we're about to find out. But before we get there, I want to focus a little bit more deeply on this idea of sacrificing. Altar reads, "It was a perfectly understandable religious concept for peoples of the ancient Near East that a national deity might need to be propitiated through sacrifice. By couching their request for a furlough for the slaves in these terms, Moses and Aaron are saying to Pharaoh that the cultic expedition." Now, whenever you hear a scholar say cult or cultic, they don't mean a bunch of people following a charismatic leader, possibly to their deaths, like we think of today. Cult, in a scholarly sense, just means the religious practices. Like you might hear a scholar talk about the temple cult in Israel, and they're just talking about the religious practices around that temple. I realize that can be a little bit confusing, but that's the difference between scholarly terminology and everyday terminology. So just wanted to throw that note in there. So he continues. They're saying to Pharaoh that the cultic expedition to the wilderness is no mere whim, but a necessary means to avert the punishing wrath of the God of the Hebrews. In this fashion, they are pitching their argument to Pharaoh's self-interest, because dead slaves would be of no use to him. End quote. What I personally find even more fascinating, though, is that such a concept has not yet appeared anywhere in the Bible. God's demanding a sacrifice so as not to punish people. I don't know about you, but with the way I was raised in fundamental Christianity, kind of had this idea that God would punish people if they didn't properly worship him. And particularly in the Old Testament, this idea that if you didn't worship God exactly how he wanted, he would strike you down with pestilence and the sword, as Moses said. But that's actually not presented anywhere in the biblical story so far. This is the first time in Scripture that God has required a sacrifice in order for someone to live. There have been previous sacrifices, but never for the explicit purpose of, I'm going to kill you if you don't sacrifice to me. In the garden, God clothed Adam and Eve in some sort of skin, but we're never actually told he killed an animal, much less a lamb. In Genesis 4, Cain and Abel offer a sacrifice, but there's no indication that it was for sin. We read that in. If anything, the words used for their sacrifice actually more closely match the thanksgiving offering from Leviticus, the kind of offering that was just because you were thankful you had this patron, this suzerain, this deity in your life, you would offer something of thanksgiving to them. So it wasn't for sin, but rather just an expression of fealty, loyalty. And that becomes really interesting then, because vegetables were an acceptable Thanksgiving offering. So that kind of removes our standard belief for why Cain's offering would have been rejected. I talk about that more in our Genesis 4 episode. The next sacrifice mentioned in Scripture is Genesis 8, when Noah sacrifices animals, but again, that's not required. It's just a Thanksgiving offering for surviving the flood. In Genesis 15, God told Abraham to make a sacrifice, but that was in order to establish a covenant. It was a symbol of the covenant. It wasn't, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill you. It's, if you don't do this, we're not following the legal customs of how we establish a covenant in this country. In Genesis 22, God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. However, again, that there was no threat of punishment if he did not. And that's a whole wild story we have to get into at some other point. At the end of Genesis 31, Jacob sacrificed in order to form a covenant with Laban. He made a sacrifice in Genesis 35 as well after his fight with the angel, and that also seems to be covenant related, a way of reestablishing the covenant of his father and grandfather. And then in Genesis 46, he makes a Thanksgiving sacrifice. So that's all of the sacrifices in the biblical story up until this point. This is the first one to present any consequence for not going through with the sacrifice. And the interesting part about it is that God never presented that stipulation. It's actually Moses and Aaron who presumably make that up in order to fit the culture of their day. And the consequences they mention are fascinating in and of themselves. That first one, pestilence, is a word that will later describe the plagues of what the King James calls a murrain. It's a weird word for animal diseases, just kind of a generic, we don't know exactly what it was, but some sort of animal disease. So it was used of that, and then also of the hail. We'll get into those when we get to those chapters. I couldn't find any commentators noting this, but I came across this as I was studying through the passage, And I can't help but think that maybe this is a little bit of a play on words. In complete disclosure here, I could be stretching this a little too far, but I figured I'd share it, and then you all can let me know whether you think I took this a little too far or not. The word for pestilence here in this verse, it's deber. Now, if you were to change the vowels from E sounds to A sounds, you get devar. And remember, Hebrew was not originally written with vowels, so all we have are the consonants, and the consonants between dever and devar are the same. It's just a matter of whether you're spelling it, if I can transliterate into English, D-E-B-E-R or D-A-B-A-R. So consonants are the same, it's only the vowels that would change. Dever is this word that means some sort of a plague, an animal disease. Devar is the word for word, and it can be a very generic word that can mean a matter, sometimes even just a thing in general. There's a whole debate about that in linguistics that I'm not going to go into today. But it could be that Moses was just trying to think up something on the fly here to try to get through to Pharaoh. And so the best thing he could come up with would be to say, oh man, if you don't let us go, our God, he's going to punish us. He's going to send a thing, Devar. And like Pharaoh looks at him and goes, what did you say? De bear, a pestilence, like just changes the vowels of it to go from this generic, God's going to do something to us, to, oh yeah, he's going to send pestilence, he's going to send disease upon us. Again, maybe I'm reading too much into this. Just because changing the vowels a little bit can make a different word doesn't automatically mean that we should read that word in instead. But I don't know, it kind of struck me as an interesting possibility, given the way Moses seems to be backpedaling and trying to present his demand in a different light. And the implication that God would send a sword on Israel is a little bit two-edged. No pun intended, since we're talking about a sword. But not only is it saying that this God of the Hebrews could potentially kill his people, kill Pharaoh's slaves, if he doesn't let them go worship, it's also implying that Pharaoh doesn't have complete authority over the people in his land. That supposedly this God of the Hebrews would be able to infiltrate Pharaoh's land and harm people who are under his rule. So in a way, it's a little bit of a jab at Pharaoh's authority as well. As you can imagine, that doesn't go very well. So in verse 4, he literally asks, "What are you doing unattended?" That would be a literal rendering of how the King James said, "Wherefore do ye, Moses and Aaron?" It's literally, what are you doing unattended? This is a classic narcissist move, right? They're going to take the problem that you have presented and switch it around so that the problem is no longer me. Now the problem is you. You come to me saying there's a problem with me, and so now I represent it as, actually, you're the one at fault here. What are you doing? Why did you leave the people unattended? His response is not just a rejection of Yahweh, but also a deeper refusal to recognize the worth and dignity of the enslaved Israelites. The only value he sees in these human beings is what they can do for him. That is what a soul-crushing machine does. That is what so many jobs do. That is what, sadly, many churches also do. It's just asking, what can you do for me? What can you accomplish? At work, how can we increase productivity even if it hurts your mental health? In a church, oh, you really like playing the instrument. Let's just force you into the choir. Or you have a couple little kids. Let's shove you in the nursery for a while. And it just sees people as what they can accomplish for some greater good instead of just seeing them as people. There is value in being a person. I know it's very cliche and it's been said way too much, but there's a reason we are called human beings, not human doings. It's not about what we can do, it's about who we are. And it is an oppressive system that refuses to see the dignity and worth inherent in every human being in favor of just seeing what can be accomplished by them. And straight up in verse 5, Pharaoh accuses Moses of giving the people Shabbat. If you're familiar with a little bit of Hebrew, you may have heard in church before, Shabbat, Sabbath, right? It is related to this word for rest. Bible Project has done great studies on this particular Hebrew word and how it's related to rest and to Sabbath and even to the number 7. It goes back to creation language, all of this. This idea of giving the people Shabbat, of giving them rest, yes, that is exactly what Moses was trying to do. They had been overworked in slavery for centuries, and God was looking to restore their state of Eden rest in the land. The word used for burdens here is pretty rare and actually only occurs 6 times in the entirety of the Tanakh, all in the first 6 chapters of Exodus here. In verse 6, Pharaoh issues a command to both the taskmasters of the people and their officers. The nuance seems to be the managers and the managers under them. So it's kind of like the regional manager and the assistant to the regional manager. You have this hierarchy where it appears that the taskmasters are the main managers, and then the officers under them are possibly Israelites themselves who were assigned by the Egyptians to oversee the work of their fellow Israelites. While it is never explicitly stated that the officers of the people are Israelites themselves, the way they speak with Moses later in the chapter does seem to make that suggestion. That would certainly complicate matters if you had Israelites working against their own family members, whether because they felt blackmailed into it, or perhaps because it was a situation where they felt they could get ahead a little bit, maybe even work some good, turn a little bit of a blind eye, be a little bit gentler with the people under them. So you have this very complex gray area now where it's not just a black and white bad Egyptians, good Israelites. You have these people who are kind of straddling the middle ground, maybe for self gain, maybe in order to try to slip in a little bit of easing the people's burdens. We don't know their motivations, and it very well may have changed from person to person, but it does certainly complicate matters. Now, the taskmaster word is actually a word that would later come to be used for tax collectors outside of Exodus. While I don't necessarily think that's the implication here in this story, it could lend a reading that suggests this was not only physical oppression, but also economic oppression over the people. In verse 8, when Pharaoh tells them to make bricks, it's actually spelled with the same letters as Laban's name, Jacob's uncle from back in Genesis, perhaps indicating yet another connection to Jacob's story, as he was forced to work longer for his reward than he wanted, leading him to eventually flee from his taskmaster/relative. Kinda sounds like Moses, who is now being forced to work longer than he wanted, and eventually flees from his taskmaster, who would also have been a relative of his. That word is actually used only twice in this chapter, and only one other time in the biblical story, and that's in the Tower of Babylon in Genesis 11. Remember, Babylon is the ultimate bad guy in the biblical story. Babylon is to the Bible what Palpatine is to Star Wars, okay? So to use a word for making bricks that is only used outside of this story to refer to the building of the Tower of Babylon, that is to put Pharaoh's Egypt, that is to put Pharaoh and Egypt in the role of Babylon, to say they are the big bad guys in the story. And just like things did not go well at the Tower of Babylon, things are about to not go well for Egypt as well. What the King James translates as straw is actually more likely chaff. It would have been something very difficult to wrangle. So if the people had to go out and gather all of this, I mean, imagine trying to hold on to all this, especially on a windy day, when it's not full stalks of straw, but rather just little bits and pieces here and there. And if they weren't able to bring enough straw, the bricks then would have been weaker, which just creates this vicious cycle where their work is not able to stand, quite literally, and that then forces them to do more work, which probably just makes the Egyptian taskmasters more upset with them, probably leading to further punishment, which makes it harder to work, and it's this vicious cycle, this system of oppression that just keeps getting worse and worse. Now, I'm guessing many of you listening have never made your own bricks before. I know I have not. If you have, I'd love to hear the story behind that, so feel free to write in and let me know if you have actually had to mix your own bricks before. Not just like concrete pre-mixed stuff you can get, at Lowe's or Home Depot, but like actually having to make your own material for bricks. That would be quite the story, I'm sure. So I found an article on Wikipedia about this that I think kind of helps to explain the brick making process and why this would have been so difficult. I realize not everyone loves Wikipedia, but it is actually a helpful starting point for study. So here's what the article said. Many clay products require the addition of other materials to add strength and durability. In the case of bricks in Old Testament Egypt, river clay is usually composed of very fine particles and so would dry slowly. Adding straw would open up the clay, allowing it to dry more readily in the sun. In addition to aiding in drying, the linear nature of straw adds stability to the clay brick in much the same way that rebar or wire mesh reinforce modern-day concrete. Bricks made without straw would break and crumble easily. Adobe bricks used around the world are generally only sun-dried, but grasses, straw, and other materials are added to the clay for the same basic reasons. End quote. Pharaoh continues in verse 8, saying that the tale of bricks which they made heretofore you will lay upon them, you will not diminish aught thereof, for they be idle. That word tale, it means the number or the measure, the amount. A literal reading of this verse would be, and the measure of the bricks which they were making the last 3 days you will lay upon them. Now you may notice that's very different from how the King James reads. Let me put those two side by side again. The tale of the bricks which they did make heretofore you shall lay on them. The measure of the bricks which they were making the last 3 days you will lay on them. What the King James translates as heretofore, and what many other versions have as before, previously, in previous days, something along those lines, it would literally be translated as the last 3 days. Now, I think a good argument can be made that this is just a Hebrew idiom that means in the past. So I'm not saying that those translations are illegitimate necessarily. However, given the way this verse is worded and the surrounding context, it makes me think that a literal translation of the last 3 days may actually be the better translation here, because Pharaoh is accusing the people of being idle. Well, why would they be idle if they're out working? The way he's presenting this, it actually makes me think that maybe in the time between Moses speaking with the elders of Israel and his appearing before Pharaoh here, perhaps, and again, I realize this is a big perhaps, I'm speculating, but I think it makes sense within the biblical story. Perhaps there were 3 days that had gone by, and the Israelites stopped working in that time period. We have to remember, they were not slaves in the sense that we think of slavery from like a couple hundred years ago here in America. It's not like there were just 5, 10, or even 100 of them serving on some plantation under one particular taskmaster. And we're talking about an entire, granted small, but still nation's worth of people at this point that are basically government workers. And anyone who has worked for the government or has dealt with someone who worked for the government, you know that is not a very efficient job. And it can be really easy sometimes for lazy workers to slip through the cracks. So I'm wondering if Moses' proclamation to the people of Yahweh's appearance instilled in them this desire for this time away that they hadn't considered possible before. And so they just stopped. They started to Sabbath rest, to celebrate Shabbat at this point. And so Pharaoh sees that and he's like, wait a second, y'all have been doing nothing for 3 days? No, 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 no. Not only do you now have to work harder, you also have to make up for those 3 days that you hadn't been working. I can't definitively prove that's what the authors intended, but I think that reading makes a lot of sense. So I'd love to hear from y'all. Let us know in the comments. You can email us or write in on our website, check in on our Discord. Let me know, what do you think of that theory? Does it work? Do you have a different theory for what might have been intended there? I love hearing from you. Before we move on from talking about this brick-making quota, I want to point you to a quote from Rendsburg and another scholar who I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce his last name. It's Bietak, Bietak, I'll say. They had written a book together, and they pointed out how we have record of this kind of tallying of bricks in ancient Egypt from outside the Bible. Let me read you the quote here. The most detailed and elaborate record of brickmaking is the Louvre leather roll, dated to year 5 of Ramses II, with various entries listed by a taskmaster. A sample entry reads, Yupa, son of Uriah, target 2,000 bricks. 660 arrived, 410 arrived, 560 arrived. Total 1,630, deficit 370. End quote. So I realize this is a really minor detail in the story, like keeping track of how many bricks are made, but I just love this kind of connection when we're able to learn something from the culture of that day outside of the Bible that says, yeah, what this story is telling us actually makes sense and fits the context well. Notice in verse 9 how Pharaoh's hardening of the people's workload is indicating the hardening of his own heart beneath all of that. We might not notice that in English, but what we've rendered as "let their more work be laid on the men" is that Hebrew word kavod that means to make heavy or to make weighty. So make their work heavier is a way of indicating that his heart is becoming heavier as well. This is yet another example of toxic, abusive, narcissistic behavior. The people brought a legitimate complaint to Pharaoh. They're saying, "You're working us way too hard here." And yet Pharaoh spun it so that their pain was their own fault for not trying hard enough. Sadly, so much of modern American Christianity does the same. You feel badly because of your own sin. If something's wrong, it's your fault. If things are going good, though, it's not because of you. It's solely because of God. Or sometimes people might even say, "Oh, don't get too comfortable there because something else bad is going to come along." Or maybe God's just, again, ready for Satan to tempt you with something. He's going to send some temptation your way, some trial your way to humble you. Like, we're never allowed to just enjoy ourselves in so much of American Christianity. It's this constant burdening of the people. It's pastors who fault you for not being in church every time the doors are open. It's a culture that says you constantly have to be trying harder, doing more. That is not the way of God. Listen, anyone who says, "let the work be heavy on them," is not living out God's goal for humanity. Anyone who is adding to the commands of God and making burdens heavier is missing the point. I mean, even Jesus came along and said that he came to lift burdens and restore rest. That should be our goal as well. What the King James renders as "let them not regard vain words" is literally "so that they don't gaze after the words of lies." This is his reasoning for giving the people more work. He's trying to distract them from what Moses is saying. He's rewriting the message of Moses. What today we might say is fake news. He is putting that label on what Moses has said, and he's trying to put a new spin on it to say that's not actually what's going on. He was also just trying to keep them so busy that they couldn't think about leaving. It's kind of that idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we talked about in our episode with Dana Hicks. Like, there are certain needs that every human has, and the more comfortable you are, the safer you are in an environment, the more you are able to focus on less essential things, the more you're able to work on emotional needs and just your own personal betterment. But if you're in the middle of nowhere trying to fend for your life with nothing but the sticks that are around you, and you have to forage for food, and you don't have a phone or any modern tools or anything, like, you're not too worried about self-improvement books, right? You're just trying to survive. I realize that modern psychology terminology was not a thing back in ancient Egypt, but I think Pharaoh knew what he was doing. He was purposefully trying to move the Israelites down that hierarchy of needs so that they wouldn't be able to even think about escaping or leaving Egypt. They would just be focused on survival, getting the job done. No extra time to fantasize. If you don't have time to get away and think, you're just going to be focused on the present and get stuck, never moving forward. Speaking of emotional needs, I want to take a minute here just to talk about the podcast, because podcasting is a lot of work. Granted, not quite as bad as having to go gather your own straw and make your own bricks, but it is still a lot of work and can be really exhausting, especially when we're trying to give you really quality content here. And this isn't the kind of thing where I can just open up your average commentary, skim over a few notes, and be ready to talk for an hour long. Right? This is something that takes hours upon hours upon hours every week to do in-depth research and make sure I'm giving you the best possible content that we can. And I hope that shows. I mean, in all honesty, if you listen to one of these series that we do, you will have learned more on that topic than I did in any of my college classes. And I want to continue providing that same level of scholarship. But the reality is, this is a hobby. And every day that the podcast is ongoing, we lose money. This is not something where we have a bunch of supporters like some bigger podcasts. And I just personally refuse to put in ads because, well, nobody likes them. And I don't like them in a podcast, so I don't want to put them in my own. I believe that this can continue on its own through word of mouth and people who care about it coming together to support it. But until we reach a point of financial support where at very least the podcast breaks even. I mean, you have to consider the website costs, the recording equipment, continuing study, conferences like Theology Beer Camp, and just honestly a lot of behind the scenes costs that aren't obvious from just listening to the podcast. Until we're at least able to break even with all that, the podcast has to come second to mental health and the rest of my life. And it has been a drain on mental health and the rest of my life recently. So you may notice, at least for a little bit here, we're probably going to start doing a little bit shorter episodes. And I realize for us, that's not saying much because our episodes have been tending to be longer and longer lately, again, closer to like an hour and a half. So I guess an hour-long episode isn't that short, but it's at least shorter for us. And I don't always like it. I like to be able to get everything in one sitting. I like to keep it all coherent like that. But the reality is the amount of time and effort it takes to study even just one chapter, it's a lot more than I can keep up with doing every week. But I don't want to stop the podcast, and I don't really want to slow it down to an every other week kind of thing. I know several others have done that, and it works for them. But I really like being able to keep putting content out every week so that we can do this study together. So I'm just going to try this for a little bit, see if it helps me to better maintain a podcast life balance, if you will. And I know that's going to extend the amount of time it takes us to get through series, but I'm just going to try to kind of have a set time limit for myself. And once I start to reach that in a podcast episode, I'm going to start looking for the most natural transition point where we can cut it off until next week. So that's why, even though I was initially trying to get through the whole chapter here, as I just realized how far along we were getting and not getting, I think it would be better to start doing shorter episodes rather than driving myself too much into a wall with all this. So I appreciate you all understanding, and I hope this allows us to continue to make even better content moving forward in the future, where we can focus on it being the absolute best it can possibly be, rather than just trying to meet a deadline of getting whatever is needed out for the week. And I don't know how long that may be for. I just happen to be at a very busy point in life right now where I have a lot going on, so I need to be able to keep everything moving with that. Maybe if things slow down, I'll start to lengthen out a little bit. And it's not necessarily something I'm going to give continual updates on. I usually try to leave most of my personal life out of the podcast, but you all share this time with me every week, so I just wanted to share with you why we may be breaking the episodes up at slightly awkward points for a little bit here. And, I don't know exactly how long that's going to last for, but I think it's going to be a healthy alternative to what I had going right now, and hopefully let us keep giving good content into the future. So we do have a lot of really good content coming up. I'm super excited for a couple special episodes, unique one-off episodes that we're going to be doing in the next month here. I do know we're going to get those in because I've already been looking into them, already been doing some study, laying out kind of a setup of how the episode's going to go. So keep your eyes peeled for those. I'll just tell you, one of them will actually be next Sunday for Easter. I'm doing a special Bible study for that. So it'll be another week or two, possibly more, depending on how things fall here, before we get back into finishing Exodus chapter 5, but we will. In the meantime, I am really excited about this episode for next week. I think there's a lot that we are all going to learn. So again, thank you all for listening. Thank you for being patient and understanding as we're trying to keep up the quality of work while also maintaining a balance with the rest of life here. Love you all. You are the best podcast audience out there. Until next week, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.